Hey everyone, we're back with more lectures for History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton. Now, last time we had left our discussion of geographical time and finally entered into social time with our overview of the Stone Age cultures. This time we're zooming in a bit more and entering into the Bronze Age, specifically a rather deep look into the early Bronze Age in Mesopotamia. Next time, we'll talk about the early Bronze Age with a different culture, and we'll continue on in that fashion. This time, we're talking specifically about the Sumerians. Now, during our talk on the ancient Sumerians, we'll be discussing what made the Sumerians, Sumerian, including this move toward urbanization, the introduction to conflict because of the urbanization, really, craft specialization, and the first true kings. Now, the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, which ran from around 3000 to 1200 BC, was a time of both innovation and destruction. The changes that occurred in the late Chalcolithic period in Mesopotamia, specifically those related to urbanization, developed an organization or like a bureaucracy that would carry through to the Bronze Age and beyond. Because of this bureaucracy, recurring issues like flooding, drought, and even locusts were planned for, counteracted, and withstood. Cities were connected by roadways as an established trade network was reimagined. Overall, the Bronze Age was the basis for all future state organizations or bureaucracy in the region. And the early Bronze Age specifically was the first step. During the early Bronze Age in both northern and southern Mesopotamia, there existed a series of city-states. Now, these were not nations or even kingdoms, as one may assume, but each city was its own organization, though obviously some cities held influence over others. Now, key among these cities early on was Uruk, whose late Chalcolithic ingenuity carried over into the early Bronze Age. Other major cities include Nippur, Larsa, and Ooredoo in the south, and Ebla, Nagar, and Mari in the north. Of particular interest to the early Bronze Age was the region of Sumer, this geographical region in southern Mesopotamia, including many settlements that were established early on in the Chalcolithic, but really came to prominence in the early Bronze Age as urban centers, around 13 cities in all. During the late Uruk period, more than half of the southern Mesopotamian inhabitants had already moved to the urban areas. And this just kept growing during the early dynastic period, obviously at the expense of the smaller countryside settlements, to around 70%. This move toward urbanization brought with it a series of benefits. For one, those living under the authority of a city benefit from a rich water supply. In fact, the Sumerians derived their economic power from water, primarily in the cultivation of cereals due to organized systems of irrigation canals. The differing cities of the region may have even formed something of a type of economic and even militaristic confederation at times, though each city remained its own entity. The urban lifestyle came with benefits beyond simple water supply, including that of more accessible trade. Items of importance could be traded within each city, but they could also be traded between cities, even over long distances. These early trade networks included metal goods such as gold, silver, tin, and copper, prestige goods such as precious stones, but also basic necessities like grain, wool, and additional foodstuffs. Unfortunately, with trade comes competition, and with competition comes the aspect of war. Concerning competition, if you think of how the river works, a city downriver was somewhat dependent upon the city farther upriver, and that the guys up the river, as they are optimizing their water supply, that's obviously going to affect the guy down the river, causing conflict between the two. Additionally, the abandoning of smaller sites in favor of larger urban centers, in effect, created these buffer zones between the cities, and further conflict arose in these buffer zones concerning resources, such as the use of canals and farmland. The escalation of economic, political, and territorial rivalry between these urban centers only grew as cities grew in scale, which continued to occur during this period as locals not only saw the attraction of larger urban areas in the form of resources, but in defense. Of course, defense is not possible without the socio-political organization and leadership of a strong ruler and the city walls that he either built or maintained. Even with looming hostilities, large-scale production gave way to innovation. Although these cities were largely populated by farmers, shepherds, and fishermen, and whereas in smaller settlements, one must be a farmer, weaver, shepherd, and everything else for one's family in order to survive, the overabundance of goods in that city meant that not every individual needs be a farmer. Instead, time permits other endeavors, such as the advances in craft specialization. Though an exact social stratification in Sumerian cities is unknown, it is known that non-agricultural related individuals worked as priests, merchants, brewers, craftsmen, weavers, and the like. Full-time devotion to these specializations led to technological progression, including the above-mentioned complex bureaucracy, but also the invention of writing, monumental architecture and art, and even the invention of the wheel, which made transport of goods over land more practical. This also meant that Sumerian farmers, who were no longer held to the time constraints of additional occupations, could now create secondary products, such as beer from barley, and develop special breeds of domesticated animals, such as sheep, for the production of textiles. The system of writing that was founded at the end of the 4th millennium carried over into the early dynastic period, which is named as such due to the fact that the names of kings, their dynasties, and their seats of power are available to the scholar in the form of the Sumerian king list, a document dating to around 1800 BC that covers the time period at hand. This list of 140 rulers over southern Mesopotamia conceptualizes the governance of this period as independent polities, each with their own ruler and therefore their own will. Interestingly, the emergence of palaces, which are possibly seen as early as the Jemdet Nasir period, appear to be completely absent in early Dynastic I. Now, a question has arisen as to whether or not this period even had true kings, as evidence for such is limited. Instead, there may have been a form of early democracy where prestige individuals made decisions by consensus. Another option for these early years is that these cities were led by a kind of priest-king, combining the roles of city administrator with those of religious duty. Additionally, many scholars are leery that the Sumerian king list is accurate at all, suggesting instead that the king list may have been an attempt to legitimize the later kings, particularly those of the city of Ison. Whereas the prior Uruk, Jemdet, Nasir phases of southern Mesopotamia were periods of expansion and growth, the early Dynastic I period was in some ways a period of regression. Now, cities continue to grow, and in fact, Eridu area was not urbanized until later, but the millennium-long process of collapse began here, having reached the apex of urbanization during the early Dynastic I period. The population of Sumerian cities soon began to decline. By early dynastic 3, true palaces were built, but with them came the first royal inscriptions, and therefore the earliest evidence of established kings. Textual records speak of the king as a shepherd, and the duties of these kings were primarily the management of economic activities and the defense of the people. Now, how well he did these jobs would determine how long he continued as king. With the rise of kingship, the previous inward focus of city-states in early dynastic 1, where they pretty much just cared about themselves, gave way to a renewed interest in external engagement with other polities. Kings increased both local and interregional trade in an attempt to exact any missing goods of which the people had need. Now, ration lists, which were basically pay scales for laborers in the Sumerian cities, began to appear at this time. And these give a glimpse into the dietary habits of the average Sumerian. These lists include what materials were given, usually barley, and how much to differing professions and their families. Exactly who received these rations is not completely understood, but the list include such occupations as shepherds, weavers, and brewers, and they include differences on the basis of both sex and age. Another aspect of the duty of a king comes in the form of preparing for and mitigating differing hazards, such as droughts, floods, locusts, and even enemy armies. Unfortunately, throughout the 3rd millennium BC, the Mesopotamian region entered into a drying phase, culminating at its driest around 2000 BC. Throughout the millennium-long early Bronze Age of Mesopotamia, it's estimated that between 5 and 10 major climatic events occurred, causing droughts that lasted 6 years or longer. And the fact that these cities actually survived this period, that's a testament to their leadership. Of note, barley, which was the crop of choice in ancient Mesopotamia, is both drought and salinity resistant. And although whether a king or simply observant farmers figured this all out is not known, it was up to the centralized government to store and maintain agricultural surpluses. Grain storage became key for survival, and therefore a highly effective means of institutional control, as well as symbols of economic strength and even divine sanction. The Sumerian king held the important roles of transporting food to affected areas and even salvaging failing crops, thus maintaining strength and status. Interestingly, palaces at both Eridu and Kish were located some distance away from the main temples, which is a move away from the whole priest-king concept, and establishes what would become standard from that time forth, namely, a separation between the religious and the secular. Thus ends our journey through the lives of the ancient Sumerians. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you need anything.